Howdy, I'm Nicholas. For those of you that don't have me in lab, I am one of the lab leaders for the Red Lab. And today I'm going to be talking about personal and family relationships, the ways in which these kinds of concepts can be helpful for thinking about stakeholders and particularly incentives, motivations for behavior, but also just the kind of general sociological organizing units of our society that impact all kinds of policies, from economic policy to engagement with political thought, and our communities, our neighbors, our kind of direct organizations that we find ourselves a part of. So we'll go over a brief review or an outline, the kind of material we're going to cover. So first, a big picture question that I hope that we continue to think through at the conclusion of this lecture is kinship based primarily on genealogical connection, that is like a direct biological mother-father relationship, brother-sister relationship, etc., or does kinship have an external basis? So we'll talk about that. And what are the family and what are the duties imposed by familial obligation? So if something like the family can be agreed to exist, or something like kinship, regardless of its basis as genealogical or external, can be defined to exist, what are the duties imposed by those kinds of connections and those kind of affinities and groups? So first we're going to talk about kinship, families, and alliance systems. We'll talk specifically about marriage, this kind of theoretical concept of habitus, and then we'll go through some motions and some drills. As always, feel free to pause this lecture to gather your wits, to finalize your notes, to rewatch content that you need just a bit more explanation on, to stretch, and very importantly, to drink water. It's really important as we navigate this world of online learning that we use the tools we already have, the schemas we already have, to figure out how online learning works best for us. So take the time that you need to ensure that you're getting the best out of this content and the best out of your environment. So, and as always, feel free to talk to me at office hours about any of these concepts, about families and personal relationships, about debating those concepts, and about other resources and readings that you could do if you want to learn more about some of the ideas I cover today. So when we theorize kinship, we're talking specifically about the kind of basic facts of life that have to do with our socialization. There's a term in sociology and philosophy that we all have pre-individual schemas. So think about the idea that you have a pre-individual schema, that before you exist, you erupt into the world with a schema that predates you. That schema is made up of your culture, your language, your family traditions, your socioeconomic context, all of those different kind of factors. So the study of kinship is the study of what one does with these basic facts of life: mating, gestation, parenthood, socialization, familial life, conflicts, the kind of alliance systems that we can generate from things like family or parental units or the lack thereof, and the consequences that we see socially and economically of those kinds of lack of things. So to theorize kinship is to first and foremost take seriously that whether we like it or not, not that it's like not apt for criticism, but family units in the West, but also all over the place, are one of the basic building blocks of social organization. Think about the welfare state, for example. In the US, we tend to lack a fairly robust welfare state that can provide for individuals with a social safety net should they fall into things like turmoil. So I'm sure a number of you have health insurance, for example, because your parents have a job that provides them with health insurance. With health insurance. In this way, kinship, or our basic relations to those around us, our parents, our siblings, our communities, our neighbors, directly impacts our motility through the world, the ways in which we are taught to act in the world, the ways in which we view others' actions in the world, and the ways in which we are allowed to act in the world. So theorizing kinship, again, first and foremostly takes seriously the fact that these basic building blocks have profound implications for both our social organization and our patterns of behavior. So the traditional organizations of family structure take a number of parts, but there's three very basic ones that we can understand that sociologists typically talk about when talking about families or kinship structures. So consanguinity, or the fact of being descended from the same ancestor, is how a lot of us think about relationships in terms of family structures. We share a grandparent. Think about your cousins here, or you can also think about the idea of memorialization. Maybe you've never met a great grandfather or a great great grandfather that was in a war, but the fact that you were descended from a kind of common ancestor, or the same familial ancestor, gives you a kind of organizing structure for your family values, your laws, your traditions, all those kinds of things, and your connections. But then there's these affinity or contractual organization systems that we often just call marital, the fact of being in a union, either through a ritual or a legal process. So when individuals get married that are not from the same ancestor, they create their own kind of subunit of family organization. We're all very obviously familiar with this, but it can impose its own kind of impositions on pre-existing family structures that come from this kind of idea of consanguinity, that, you know, we have these traditions, somebody marries into these traditions, and now there has to be a whole kind of reorganization of how that family functions. And then shared consumption. These are just general kin for whom the acquiring and consumption of resources is shared, such that they found themselves kind of bound together. We can think here of tribal organizations, or of squatters in New York City. For those of you who are familiar with the history of squatting in New York City, were individuals who often found themselves experiencing housing insecurity, would collectively occupy homes or buildings or structures that they believed to be unoccupied. And would then find themselves in kind of chosen families or collective families. There's some great literature out there about the New York City squatters and their history and creating some of the initial chosen families in America, but also things like communes, where individuals come together to experience a kind of a kind of intellectual richness, or a kind of experiential richness, and find themselves bound together, and in many ways create really valid forms of kinship that can rival the kinds of models of organization that we see traditionally in family structures, marital structures, or structures that follow lines of dissension from common ancestors. So to speak about families is to speak mainly philosophically about structuralism. It's to recognize that all systems have a structure, and it's that structure and its rigid rules, emphasis on rules here, that creates the lines of permissibility for behavior oftentimes, or the expectations for normalcy oftentimes. The guy you see pictured here on the right is Levi Strauss. He is a famous anthropologist and sociologist. If you're interested in anthropology and sociology, he's oftentimes thought of the founder of modern anthropology and sociology, not a person that's without own critique, but an very influential figure in how we think about structures and systems and the organizations that arise in human culture. So the family is an ancient structure that arises through the formation of an incest taboo, where very obviously there's lines of permissibility between who individuals are allowed to create specific kinds of relationships with. So endogamy and exogamy are these sociological terms that helped us think through relationships and mating and marriage, dating, these kinds of things. So endogamy is the process of finding a relationship within your immediate social group, within your tribe, within your neighborhood, within your school. Exogamy is the idea of finding a relationship outside of your immediate social group, outside of your neighborhood, outside of your culture, outside of your ethnicity, outside of your religion, outside of your school, whatever your immediate context may be. And obviously, endogamic relationships tend to be cleaner relationships initially for your social group, because they're ready to accept the kind of homogeneity that would come with that relation. We can expect more clean lines, and that the expectations for behavior are already pre-established, and both individuals are already assimilated and acculturated to those kinds of behaviors. But exogamy gets more complicated when you marry outside of your social group, outside of your religion, for example. Then this gets a bit messier, and social expectations can rupture and tensions can happen. I want to note here that many individuals think of the family as a unit of organization and unity, but because of these expectations, the family can immediately become one of the most ripe areas for conflict when these lines of permissibility are drawn and behavior is not cleanly followed. So this brings up the idea of assortative mating, the phenomenon whereby most individuals will marry or will develop relationships or will develop civil unions or will develop meaningful partnerships that follow lines that are clean along socioeconomic class, along ethnicity, oftentimes along language, and along religion. This is just the concept of homophilia, the idea that, you often hear the opposites attract, but at least in sociology, the opposite is quite true, that commonality attracts. And in some ways, this is a fairly intuitive idea. Think about language barriers, for example. If you and somebody else that you thought you felt a very meaningful connection to had a language barrier where you did not speak the same language, it would be incredibly difficult to maintain a kind of meaningful commitment, navigate conflicts, explore with that individual the kind of things that would benefit a meaningful relationship. Then it becomes incredibly difficult to practice exogamy. So endogamy tends to be more common, but exogamy is becoming increasingly common as we redefine the entire paradigm of kinship and in particular marital relations. So we create things like, we've evolved from the creation of clans, lineages, houses, tribes, etc. All these kinds of areas where endogamy, you can think here of Romeo and Juliet, where you have two houses, and you have this kind of connection between Romeo and Juliet, who are between different houses that creates serious kind of issues in terms of the permissibility or the social acceptedness of that kind of union. And these things have morphed not too differently into our neighborhoods, into our social groups, into our chosen families. So the foundations of dissent are how we create our lines of tradition or lines of culture. So, this is traditionally how sociologists think about the foundations of dissent. So you begin with the kind of first ones, the established examples and lore of first ones that creates a sense of indebtedness. You can think here of your ancestors. So if any of you are first, second, third, fourth, even fifth generation immigrants, your family came from Italy, for example, or from Poland or from Ireland, then this is where we often get the idea of a first one. Oh, they were the first individual from your family to come here to establish for themselves a life. They had a suitcase and $20 and they arrived in Ellis Island and that's all they had. And these lures create a kind of sense of indebtedness, that we owe our ancestors something for the kind of work they put through to establish a legacy that creates us here and now. And this indebtedness leads itself to its kind of own creation. My apologies. In respect of tradition, such that we carry it on. And then we create ties to intergenerational traditions to location and time, and this normalizes the image of the family. I was listening to a podcast this morning, for example, where a winemaker was explaining that his family had been making wine in Italy for 300 years, and they had a sense of indebtedness to both their name and their land and that location. So these kinds of ideas tend to incorporate even our connections to nationality, for example, to land, to geographic regions, and what that means. All of these things are ideographs or blank terms that we load or enumerate with its own kind of context that we bring to the table. And then ancestry starts over. You break with the image of the direct ancestor. You become the pioneer, the traveler, the migrant, and you become your own kind of first one to reset the table. I think here it's great to think about a minute example like holidays or Thanksgiving, for example. I'm sure a number of you have a tradition for how you practice Christmas or Thanksgiving or inter-holiday here, where you gather at a matriarch's house or a patriarch's house, your grandmother or your grandfather or your parent. But eventually, families will go through a process of breaking with the direct ancestry, where they'll have their own children and have their own grandchildren and have to have their own Thanksgiving. And eventually, what was once a simple kind of kind of almost unbreakable image of how you would hold Thanksgiving over time unfolds and become more like a tree, which is with its own branches. So you have this cycle. So ancestry is not necessarily a straight line. It's always kind of a cycle of making and remaking traditions. But we oftentimes view it as a line, which is what makes things like breaking traditions so taboo or so ripe for conflict in a number of family areas, even though in reality, the facts of history and sociology reflect that ancestry, tradition, and commitments are never that clean of a line, but oftentimes always go through this process of revisioning and remaking necessarily. So the nuclear family is this kind of popularized idea from the 50s that a majority of us are already familiar with, where you have a mother, a father, and a child or children, and it's all one small household unit. You can think of modern suburbia here and the rise of suburbia in post-World War II economies, where the boom in economic productions and availability really helped create a nuclear family for a number of individuals, but especially white individuals who could get loans through the Housing Act, through the Housing Lending Act of the 1950s. That allowed individuals to kind of create, for the first time, jump-started nuclear families. But the nuclear family is relatively in decline. This graph shows rates of nuclear families compared to 2000s and other organizations of family units. And we can see a kind of change and shift. And we can talk about some of these changes. I think a number of them can be attributed to changing values, to changing religious organizational structures, to changing economic freedoms for women, to changing expectations of sexuality for children. All of these kind of things can contribute to why a nuclear family has been in decline, but a number of them are probably socioeconomic in nature. As individuals have to move through the process of urbanization, for example, to new cities for work, can also contribute to things like a lack of a tight family unit or a nuclear family. But there's contesting theories about why it's in decline, but it's important to note that yes, the nuclear family is in some ways in decline. So it's kind of prematurely, the question, is the family in decline? And I think that, we oftentimes hear in both literature and popular culture this idea that the family is under attack, especially from more conservative circles. But even I think from a number of neoliberal circles, that the family is in decline and it's under attack. And in a lot of ways, this is true. There's a kind of decline of our traditional conceptions of family. But again, I wanted to bring us back to this kind of foundation of dissent, that families and our units of social organization are always reinventing themselves. The nuclear family is a kind of concept from the 50s that, it's a single household unit. There's a mom, a dad, children, and they have their own house in suburbia. The dad commutes to work, the mom stays at home, does a number of things, right? This is a family idea, a kind of imago that hasn't survived very long, but it's also relatively modern. Before the family unit, we had things like row houses, where individuals would live in these massive kind of townhomes in big cities. We had farms and urbanizations where uncles and aunts would live in would live in multi-family homes altogether. So yes, the family is in decline in our modern conceptions, but our modern theory of the family and its image is so modern, and other things predate it, that families are always reinventing themselves in ways that's important to realize. So some critiques of the family unit, even though its organizations have changed throughout time, they share some common critiques throughout time. Socrates in The Republic, I believe in book 4, book 7, and book 9 of The Republic, attacks the family as a unit of organization, as messy and as non-universal, in that families can all enculturate their children in drastically different ways. Some parents can be bad parents. Some children are perhaps too much for the individual parent union, and the family is just not clean enough, not a kind of aristocratic enough system of organization for a society or a state, and that rather as opposed to parenting, child rearing should be the job of a kind of communal group of individuals who are experienced and talented in that realm and can enculturate all children in a kind of similar way, so that we can think of of society as kind of picking up the slack of where families can be left behind, or that similarly, child rearing may put too hard of a burden on individuals whose talents and time are better spent preparing for war, better spent creating art, better spent acting as statesmen. So Socrates was very critical of the family as dividing the kind of social labor of society in a way that was A, generally unproductive, and B, not perhaps fit for both the needs of children or the talent of parents and families. We can think of here a number of books that we might be familiar with, like The Giver, where families have an interesting kind of relationship to society's needs, where perhaps families aren't the ones who actually bear children, but are given a responsibility to rear children. All this kinds of converse methods of family rearing in its relationship to society. Also, there's increasing feminist critiques of the family as an organization structure. This is where a kind of own independent lecture is really deserved for what we call social reproduction theory. Incredible area of scholarship and literature arising out of sociology and philosophy and critical feminist studies that takes a look at the ways in which society survives by all of this unrecognized labor that's primarily conducted by women in society. Things like women tend to be the primary caregivers of children, the person who gives the majority of their time to child rearing, that gives the majority of their time to cooking, to cleaning, to medical care, to behavioral care, to emotional care, to a number of areas where if this labor was simply not done, society would writ large collapse in ways that could be detrimental. So these kind of increasing scrutinies that pay attention to the unrecognized social reproductive labor of women in particular, kind of try to critique the family in ways that notices that there's an asymmetric divide of labor. If the family is the kind of basic building block of social organization, then there's a kind of asymmetric divide in a number of families where women in particular are tasked with doing a lot of work that goes unrecognized and have to give up a number of their rights, fall under a dominant schema of patriarchy and organization. But it's important to note that not all families historically or even presently are like this. A number of homes experience things like single father homes or multi-family households or strong cultural ties to other households, or mixed parenting models that are becoming more and more common, or countries like Ethiopia or Eritrea, where matriarchal households are incredibly common. And then there's a Marxist critique of the family, where Marx was really concerned with the family's ability, similar to Socrates, to have a proper division of labor that was productive for society and its needs, and that took adequate care, and that took adequate care of children in a way that the state might be able to better facilitate. There was something a bit too private about the family for Marx, but again, the kind of thing that deserves its own kind of attention structure. So marriage specifically is a phenomenon that deserves its own attention. Marriage is what we call a cultural universal, in that we see marriage everywhere, across a number of centuries in a number of geographies in countless regions. And marriage is caused for a number of reasons. It's caused for economic reasons, legal reasons, social reasons, spiritual or religious reasons, cultural reasons, libidinal reasons, and financial reasons. So in this sense, marriage is oftentimes contractual, and the individuals come together to fulfill some kind of joint need, a need for love, a need for affinities, a need for kind of financial security, a need for a kind of social expectation to be met, to jump legal hurdles, to perhaps to co-fulfill a kind of spiritual desire or religious expectation. And Claude Levi-Strauss was critical of marriage in that in some ways he called it an exchange of women in a number of cultures, where the contractual nature of marriage was seen as a way of moving individuals in and out of households to reorganize their debts into different households. And it's also similarly been criticized, we've spoken about this, as an institution by feminist scholars. And it's on decline and suffering from high rates of divorce, specifically in the West, in Europe and America. But we'll talk about this more. And things like heterosexual or queer marriages, monogamous marriages, temporary marriages, group marriages are all complicating our traditional discourses around marriage, its institutionalization, and its products. So marriage is important legally and culturally because it's oftentimes viewed as a transfer of rights or an imposition of duties, where you either give up some rights or you are imposed upon some duties, things like labor and wealth. So in a lot of countries, whenever you marry into a relationship, you get all these duties of labor placed upon you, sometimes regardless of your gender or sex, but other times explicitly because of your gender or sex. And wealth, we know about things like prenups, where you can either marry into wealth or protect your wealth. So there's a kind of a transfer of rights of wealth here and an imposition of duties of labor here. Also a responsibility for debt. If you marry many times, the debt of your spouse becomes your debt. And that's an interesting way of economic organization, where we tie together debt in families. There's also the control of the state over affairs during incapacitation. So, if you or your spouse are just unavailable, if you both die, then your children, unless plans are made, can become products of the state. Establishing the second legal guardian of a parent's child, this is an important thing to think about, in that parents themselves have to navigate conversations about who is a primary guardian. If we are unavailable, who do children go to? Establishing the joint fund of property for the benefit of children, kind of managing an estate. What will I leave behind for my children? A number of marriages spend a large part of their time trying to figure out how can we have financial security and then leave something forward for our children, like property, houses, a college fund, or the lack of all of those things can be really impactful and meaningful on children's future lives. And establishing the relationship between the families of spouses, just bringing together families for different duties or legal relationships or traditions. So global divorce rates, as I mentioned, are on the rise, in particular in the West. And we can think about, we can theorize a number of reasons for this, specifically in Western nations that are placing an emphasis on taking a keen look at things like social reproductive theory of trying to increase economic freedom for individuals. So we can think about also areas where marriage is not as much in decline, and the kind of cultural, religious, or political reasons that might prevent that same kind of mobilization of freedom, or might cement a stronger affinity to the institution of marriage. It's also important to note that prescriptive forced or child marriages are still relatively common, even though they're on the decline in a number of countries, and that these kinds of unions are violations of human rights, a violation of autonomy, and are bankrupt in their appreciation for human dignity. And anti-miscegenation laws in the US kind of speak to our own history of endogamy and exogamy in the US, and criminalizing specifically interracial marriages, where states had specific laws about kind of banning these kinds of approaches to marriage between ethnicities, between races, to kind of maintain a kind of familial approach, a kind of societal approach to white supremacy, and around a mythos, a mythology of purity. And it wasn't until the Supreme Court v. Loving that, sorry, maybe not the Supreme Court, I think maybe Georgia or Virginia v. Loving, that deserves its own attention, a court case that ruled that these kinds of unions are in no way constitutionally criminalized. And then gay marriage, obviously, is increasing in its acceptance and its legalization, but still notably criminalized in a number of countries. So you can take a look at the map for a sec. So finally, we'll talk about this idea of habitus. It's a more theoretical concept from the French theorist Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu talks about are kind of modes of understanding the world around us by becoming familiar and enculturated with specific habits. So in sociology, habitus compromises our socially ingrained habits, our skills, and our dispositions. It is the way that individuals perceive the social world around them and react to it. These dispositions are usually shared by people with similar background. So in debate, it's really important to speak about incentives. The incentives people have for holding certain beliefs, for engaging in behavior, and oftentimes these incentives can be easily explained by their pre-cultural schemas, by their backgrounds, their habitus. So we have abstract schemas, our modes of perception and interpretation for the world. These are our schemes of perception, our modes of classification, our adjudication of appreciation, our feelings, and our actions. And these all come from our culture. Here we can think a lot about things like white fragility, or our kind of approach to things like gay marriage, depending on the background that we come from. Our immediate knee-jerk reactions to its policies, languages, ideas, theories are going to come first and foremost, oftentimes from our family unit, or conversely, the kind of disengagement, dissatisfaction, or anger we experience around certain ideas can be a rebellion from family structures. So, you have your child's habitus, which is built off of your parents' modeling, which is directly derived from a cultural foundation. So we have terministic screens, or what Kenneth Burke calls a screen composed of terms through which humans perceive the world. And that's direct attention away from some interpretations and towards others. So depending on the ways in which you've been taught about an idea, oftentimes comes from your parents' own modeling, from their own culture. And in some ways, this is not unfair. If we think about the incredibly difficult and daunting task of raising a child, knowing that like their entire life is in your hands, their outcome is dependent on your merits and your experiences, what wealth of knowledge or deposit of faith do you have to turn to, if not for your own cultural foundation, your religion as a sense of epistemic authority, your own parents as an experience and background for child rearing, your neighborhood as kind of a model for good behavior, your language is kind of setting the grounds for acceptable terminologies, all those kinds of things. So some motions and some drills to look at as you navigate on your own independently the next part of this lecture. So drill time. Gold and silver lab, I want you to draft a full substantive argument for any of the following motions. We'll speak about those motions in a second, excuse me. And then blue and red lab, watch the following speech and respond with an assumption model style refutation. So I assume you're familiar with what I'm talking about, but in case you're not, arguments make assumptions. So make explicit the implicit. If I'm making an argument about the fact that the state cares about individuals, I'm making a number of assumptions about the nature of the state, its organization. And so to refute via assumption model is to say, team proposition, the first speaker, whoever, makes 3 fatal assumptions. First, their argument assumes X. Second, it assumes Y. Third, if necessary, it assumes Z, right? And these assumptions kind of work as an expose of the holes or flaws of the argument by pointing out what warrants are missing or taken for granted, oftentimes by foiling that which they're contrary to, the counterfactual that's probably more likely to be the case. So you can find it on YouTube by searching Cambridge IV 2020 Round 1. It's an online tournament for college. And right around the 4-minute mark, the prime minister or the first proposition speaker makes an argument in this motion that tightly integrated family units are beneficial because they provide an economic support system for their members. That's in its most basic form, the argument. You can listen yourself at the 4-minute mark to this argument, and you can take your own take on the argument's construction. But your ultimate job is to identify the assumptions and make the implicit explicit. If you have a hard time on YouTube finding the video, go to tinyurl.com/familydrill. It will take you straight to the YouTube video somewhere, I think, around the 4-minute mark. to all labs, after you've done kind of your assignment, giving me a 1 to 2.5 minute Flipgrid video. Submit your Flipgrid video on flipgrid.com/GDS family and submit it under the tab appropriate for your lab. Cool. So if you're in the gold or silver lab, these are your motion options. You can screenshot or pause or take a look at these motions. The first motion: this house believes that countries with booming populations should allocate every adult a single tradable permit to have a child. Or this house believes that schools should teach children to be skeptical of parental authority. And then finally, this house believes that having children is immoral. You can choose any of these three motions and then just draft a full substantive argument, and you can choose proposition or opposition, just make it explicit what your choice is, and submit your video to flipgrid.com/GDS family. Gold, silver lab, and blue and red lab, after you are done making your Flipgrid video, go to this URL, tinyurl.com/drill submission. It will direct you to a Google form, and you can just share a link to your Flipgrid video. You should get that option after you submit your Flipgrid video so that your lab leaders, other instructors can see it and give you feedback. Or for example, if you wanted to go to office hours to anybody, me or anybody else, and say, I want feedback, that link will be a great way to share quickly and independently your content specifically. Awesome. As always, feel free to speak to me at office hours about any of these concepts, about debating these motions, about feedback for your submission, about any of the ideas I've talked about social reproductive labor theory, which deserves its own independent, which deserves its own lecture or attention, which I kind of wish I had kind of given now or organized one. But super fascinating area of emerging theory of social organization. So yeah, feel free to talk to me. Get some water, rest, take a break, and do your drill. A quick note on the drills. Our expectation is that the majority of drills are being completed because it benefits you. But if you just need to take a time to not submit your drill immediately or right now, that's fine. No one's going to hunt you down. I won't hunt you down. Your drill's absence will be noted, but it will, in no way will be penalized. But you're highly encouraged to do these drills. And then I really like utilizing the Flipgrid video so that I can actually watch the content being delivered, so that I can provide, especially people who are in my lab, feedback on these kinds of ideas on these workshops and these lectures. Awesome. Have a great day.